Thanks for joining us. Happy allergy season, everyone. Just to start, I'm Adam Bosch. I'm the president and CEO over here at Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. I know that many of you have joined us on our Lunch and Learn webinars in the past. If I look a little different, I've just discovered portrait lighting here on Zoom, so I may be coming to you in a slightly better lighting, slightly better definition. So I haven't done anything to my face, just played with the computer a little bit. Nice to see everyone this afternoon. We are here to talk about a new report that Pattern is publishing today in partnership with some of our friends from NYU, a team of really wonderful and talented graduate students. And the genesis of this actually goes back a few years. We were doing a report for my friend John Cooney over Construction Industry Council that looked at investments in water, sewer, roads, and bridges. And we had some thoughts about what might come from that study, but the central finding of that study was very different than what we thought it might be. And the central finding was really that there was a lot of state money available to invest, especially in water and sewer infrastructure. But that money, by and large, was not reaching our communities because our small and medium communities really had a difficult time navigating the complex programs that were set up to try to get this money to them. And it was with that in mind that we thought about exploring this topic a little more because we know on scale, our communities of different sizes have needs for funding for infrastructure, for parks, for housing, for economic development projects. And what we found as we began to talk to folks is that across that entire board of civic topics, there was a need that was often unmet simply because there wasn't enough capacity and skill to chase the sources of the money. And so here at Pattern, we were very fortunate to be able to team up with some wonderful, as I say, wonderful graduate students from NYU to really dig into this, to do a few dozen interviews with government experts, program experts, and understand what is the process, where does the process break down, what could our communities do to have more capacity to compete, right? Hence the title of the study. And we wanted to provide really easy tools, really good advice, and start a discussion about whether there's a regional model that could help more of our communities meet their needs and get funding to meet those needs. And that's the report you're going to hear about today. So I'm going to not say really much more than that. I'm going to pass it over to Daria Guzzo from the NYU team. And she and Jasmine and Yael and Will are going to walk you through the report they've put together. After that, we're going to hear from a regional planning board up in the Adirondacks, up in the North Country, that is doing this really, really well. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So thanks again for joining us. And Daria, take it away.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Adam shared, we are a group of soon-to-be graduating Master of Public Administration students at NYU. And for the past 2 semesters, we have been completing our capstone project, serving the Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress as our client. We are thrilled to present our final project to you today, titled Capacity to Compete, a Roadmap for Municipal Grants in the Hudson Valley. While we get started, we'd love if everyone could drop in the chat your name and the municipality you serve or the organization you are affiliated with, so we can have a sense of who's joining us today. Next slide, please. Throughout the past year, we have been exploring the question, how can small and mid-sized municipalities in the Hudson Valley better access competitive state and federal grant funding? In a moment, I'll briefly introduce our team. I'll then give an introduction of our process. We'll talk about our findings, but then we'll spend most of our time talking about our recommendations, which include models of collaboration, a newly developed grant readiness scorecard and grant checklist, as well as some suggestions for changes at the state agency level. We are also very excited to be joined today for a brief case study presentation by Beth Gillis with the Lake Champlain, Lake George Regional Planning Board, which you'll hear much more about. And lastly, like Adam said, we'll end with some Q&A with the audience. Next slide. Here is the wonderful team that's been working with Pattern. We have my colleague Yael Gonzalez-Mailer, I'm Daria Guzzo, and then my colleagues Jasmine Kay and Will Viederman. As you can see, we are all MPA students, but specializing across public policy, management, leadership, and finance. We are really lucky that our team brought a diverse set of backgrounds and expertise to this project, so we've all looked at the issues and potential solutions through slightly different lenses, in a way that we hope has led to meaningful recommendations for all the stakeholders who are involved in the competitive grant process. Next slide. Through our research, we have viewed the landscape of federal and state grant funding as both a challenge and an opportunity in the Hudson Valley. As I know everyone on this call knows, the Hudson Valley has significant funding needs, whether that's for major infrastructure projects, water and sewer, economic development, parks, you name it. We also heard repeatedly that there is a feeling that more money has shifted to competitive grants from a more formulaic disbursement model over the years. This means that smaller municipal staff forces have to dedicate more time and resources for funding they desperately need for their projects, but have to compete against larger and maybe more well-resourced communities. As a result, staff either have to take time away from their daily responsibilities to work on these grants, or municipal leaders have to use their resources to hire experts to do that work. Either way, we know it's a strain on local municipalities and their capacity. Our project had two primary parts. First, we conducted a robust academic literature review to explore the grant landscape, both regionally and nationally. And then we conducted 38 interviews, which were conducted either one-on-one or in a small group format. We interviewed very small towns and villages to more mid-sized municipalities, supervisors and county leaders, newer and more experienced representatives, elected officials, Democrats and Republicans, lobbyists, technical assistance experts, and more. We feel we captured a very robust stakeholder group throughout our project. I'm now going to pass it to my colleague Jasmine to dive into our findings.
Thanks so much, Daria. So as Daria mentioned, we spoke with a robust group of local stakeholders, county stakeholders, state stakeholders, and a wide array of different folks where we really came to these 4 key findings. So I'm gonna dive into the first 2, and then I'm gonna pass it over to Yael, who will talk about our final 2 findings. So the first finding, which was something that Daria started to talk about, was related to capacity. So the key issue that pretty much, I would say unanimously we found among local governments in the Hudson Valley is that capacity was the primary constraint for their ability to be able to access grant funding. So capacity can be defined in a variety of different ways. It can be a low resources when it comes to staff. It could be funding resources, or it could just be, quite frankly, a lot of competing priorities that local governments face. And this concern with capacity really gets in the way in terms of local governments of feeling like they can get in the game when it comes to competing for grants. Additionally, you would assume that when there is limited capacity, one of the answers would be, let's collaborate. We have similar needs, we have similar projects, let's work together. However, through our research, there was a lack of real collaboration between local governments in the Hudson Valley, which is something that we will explore further in our recommendation section. Next, we came up with a framework to talk about the 4 stages of the grant process. So we define it here as first, planning, second, searching, third, applying, and finally, implementing. This is a helpful framework because oftentimes it is rare to have strength across all 4 of your stages. You may be really strong in the planning process, but then when it comes to implementing, which we found was the area that the most local governments struggle with, that can be a challenge. And so thinking about the grant process as these 4 stages helps to provide a framework that these all occur, but being able to kind of segment them out, we found was a helpful framework. And we'll also provide more recommendations that are connected to this. I will add that this is, as we have them as arrows, that they all go into each other, this should be an iterative process. So they should continue to bleed into each other as local governments continue to approach the grants process. And I'll turn it over to Yael, who will take us through our next 2 findings. But before I do that, I have one more thing that I wanted to highlight related to that, which is related to one of the key findings that we had that was highlighted to us by Natalie Lincoln, who I believe is on this call. And Natalie serves in a role where she oversees the grant process for both Congressmember Pat Ryan's office and Congressmember Paul Tonko's office. So she splits her time helping both of those federal offices with the grants process. And one of the things that was really insightful from our conversation with Natalie was that oftentimes local governments know their needs. So they know that they need help with, say, water infrastructure, but they don't necessarily know their projects. So this is essential because when you look at those stages of the grant process, when you're planning, when you're searching, when you're applying, you need to know those projects so people like Natalie and people like both at the federal and the state level are able to provide that assistance to you based on those projects. So this is something that we heard repetitively was that you need to know beyond just building support, beyond knowing what those areas are, what those specific projects are, which helps provide more specific grant funding. And now I'll turn it over to Yael.
Thank you, Jasmine. So kind of to continue on this 4 stages that we have been talking about, our third finding is that the stages are interdependent and that the process will break at its weakest link. So successful towns connect all 4 stages through one person or team. This basically means that strength in one stage cannot compensate for weakness in another. And so whether it be planning, searching, applying, or implementing, the stage a community struggles with most is where the process is more likely to break. And this happens in real life. We have even heard of municipalities that have had grants clawed back, which has left them unable to fund programs that were already underway. And one of the best ways that we have heard to address this is by connecting all 4 stages by having one person or team oversee them. And this can be done with internal staff or external consultants. So basically, if the person managing, say, implementation is also responsible for searching and applying, then they can manage that department's capacity more effectively. Or most importantly, perhaps, if the person who is writing the application is connected to the entire planning process, then their application is going to have a more compelling narrative and it's going to be more competitive since it will be directly informed by the municipality's strategic goals. And in the next slide, we can see that a great example of this is the village of Rhinebeck. Rhinebeck maintains a contract with an engineering firm that handles the engineering and planning work for the village, and it assists them throughout all 4 stages of the grant process. So this means that this firm knows the village's needs and alerts them of grants and opportunities and timelines and works with them to prepare any application materials and finally helps them implementing any awarded grants. And so one thing we have identified as a key to Rhinebeck's success is that they have the same consultants working with them throughout all 4 stages. This makes the process a lot more efficient because there's a lot more cohesion and information sharing instead of a fragmented system. And we've also identified that this firm clearly has a stake in the success of every step of the process because they're the ones who are going to be in charge of any follow-up. And when we spoke to the village supervisor, Gary Bassett, he did note that it was a challenge sometimes paying this firm an ongoing retainer, and he recognized that it might create some political risks, but he emphasized continuously the value that the firm produces, and that at least in his eyes, it has paid for itself many times over through the increase in grant funding it has brought to the village. And our last finding, finding 4, is that municipalities can only do so much because state and federal processes and requirements present enormous obstacles. This basically means that system design hinders potential. We heard over and over about how complex the state and federal processes for grants are and how much this can actually dissuade localities from pursuing grant funding. Some state agencies we've heard were slightly easier to navigate than others, and this is something that Jasmine will highlight a little bit later in the presentation. But generally speaking, we heard that the systems were inaccessible, slow, and just overly complicated. So this means that even though municipalities should definitely still do their best to work within the existing system and maximize the grants that they get, a lot more could be done at the level of state and federal agencies to improve the experience of municipalities throughout the region. And now that we have gone through our main 4 findings, I'm going to pass it over to Will, who will begin sharing our recommendations.
Thank you, Yael. So I'll give a brief overview of these 4 recommendations, and then we will dive deeper into each of them. The first is that municipalities should work together to expand capacity through regional or collaborative models. We, in particular, recommend that counties should lead the way in this in the Hudson Valley, and we'll say a little bit about why that is. Second, we have developed a new grant readiness scorecard to assist as a tool for municipalities to evaluate where they stand in each of these 4 stages, identify some strengths and weaknesses, and start to build up their capacity from their weakest link. Our third recommendation is we have also developed a new grant checklist to guide this process and to help build up capacity. And fourth, just as Yael just said, the state and federal agencies create a lot of the burden here. And so we have some recommendations as to how to improve that process and on their end. Next slide, please. Our first recommendation is really focused on that first finding, which is that municipalities have insufficient capacity to do the kind of work and win the grants that they want to win. And fundamentally, we believe that the way to maximize capacity is to work together, that many communities have both similar needs and similar processes, and finding opportunities for collaboration across perhaps a grant or across a contract are a way to build capacity collaboratively and across the region as a whole. You know, we heard from municipalities who recognized that they had problems with their water infrastructure and their neighbor had problems with their water infrastructure, but they're both applying for grants competitively. And perhaps a project that addresses both of their needs could serve them both better and be more easily won and administered. Another challenge that municipalities have is trying to do the actual work of winning these grants. And often they will have contracts or other grant writers, and sharing these services could also be an opportunity for collaboration. Next slide, please. In our conversations with municipalities, there were sort of three different models of collaboration we explored. One is led by municipalities. An example of this might be the Hudson 7, which are a group of 7 municipalities in the Hudson Valley that all share the same water source. And they have started to build a collaboration around trying to win grants for their shared water infrastructure rather than individually. Municipalities can get together and try to build the capacity together without outside forces involved. Another possible model is being led by a nonprofit. Nonprofits are often well positioned to share resources across a space and to plan across a broader region without the sort of day-to-day administrative challenges that many municipalities face. And finally, the third, and frankly, the model that we recommend coming out of our research is county-led models for collaboration. There are 3 reasons why counties are really well positioned in the Hudson Valley to lead this sort of regional collaboration work across grants. The first is that given how many of the challenges are for small municipalities, counties are a great place to sort of share resources and to do that sort of regional planning and resource distribution work. The second are, frankly, we heard most commonly from the municipalities we talked to that counties were the right place. And so we think that for the counties on the call and also for municipalities, communities want support from counties in this work. And the third reason is that in many cases, counties are already doing some of this work. They are already doing regional grant planning or regional collaboration, and building in a little bit more intention and a particular model that I'll talk about in a moment might be a way for counties to build up and continue to bring in resources into the community. The model that we want to talk about today in particular, and we're very grateful to have Beth Gillis from the Lake Champlain, Lake George Regional Planning Board on the call. She will speak a little bit more about this in a little bit. But the Lake Champlain, Lake George Regional Planning Board has done incredible work in the North Country around regional planning and regional grant capacity building. The region has more than half of the communities in the North Country are fewer than 5,000 people. And so they really feel the deep capacity challenges that many small and mid-sized Hudson Valley communities face. And so the Regional Planning Board has developed a unique model where they get a little bit of funding from counties in the area, but at no cost to municipalities, they do all 4 stages. And so they plan for the grants, they search for the grants, they apply for the grants, and they implement the grants. All they ask for is that if they win the grant, they receive the administrative portion of the grant. And that allows them to build up their expertise and capacity, not overburden towns, and ultimately have enormous success in winning grants. I hope Beth will tell us a little bit more about it later, but the one stat that I want to leave this with is that for every dollar that the counties in their region give them, they brought in in 2023, $224 of grant funding. And so they are just an incredible example of how an investment at the regional level can bring multiples on itself of grant funding into a region and help to actually meet the infrastructural and capacity needs. And now I will pass it over to Yael for our second recommendation.
Thank you, Will. Our second recommendation is that municipalities should use the newly developed grant readiness scorecard to evaluate where they stand in the 4 stages and strengthen their capacity starting at their weakest stage. Basically, because this process of pursuing grants is complex and time-consuming and resource-intensive, it would be natural to assume that communities should just apply for the largest possible grants because they would yield a higher return on investment. However, many of our interview subjects on all sides of the grant process and of different levels of capacity have instead emphasized the exact opposite, that municipalities should start small by applying for small grants and then iterate on the process from there. This is because of a few reasons. First, grant makers usually look for demonstrated success when administering grants before before making any major awards. Second would be that smaller grants usually offer more of an opportunity to learn how to improve and to build up this capacity. And lastly, smaller grants are more easily won, which can lead to more of an opportunity to build political support for future investment in grant capacity. So basically, starting small and iterating from there is the best way to strategically grow grant capacity over time. And so in the next slide, you can see that to help municipalities with this, we have built a grant readiness scorecard. The scorecard is linked in the report, and we have a QR code here you can scan that will lead you to a downloadable version. And we will also have the QR code at the end of the presentation, so no worries if you miss it right now. But basically, your municipality can use this tool right now to assess your relative strengths and weaknesses throughout the 4 stages. As you can see, we have the 4 stages: planning, searching, applying, and implementing, and 4 levels of readiness for each, from early stage, emerging, equipped, and established communities. And so you can use this to assess where you land in each stage, and that for best results, focus your capacity building in the stage for which you are weakest. And then once that stage is no longer the weakest, then move on a lot of your capacity building efforts into a different stage. And now Daria will share our third recommendation, which includes another tool that we have developed for you to use to improve your access to competitive grant funding.
Thanks, Yael. So building off the grant readiness scorecard, we also wanted to capture the many steps, tips, and sometimes forgotten elements of the planning, searching, applying for, and implementation of grants. First, almost every town that we talked to shared that they had won a competitive grant in recent years, and they felt that those efforts were worthwhile. But we developed this step-by-step checklist so that once a municipality identifies where it wants to strengthen its grant capacity, it can cross-reference this resource to ensure they are addressing all the important steps. And on the next slide, we kind of show a screenshot in the QR code for the downloadable version as well. Again, we'll share it at the end too. Surely this checklist is not fully exhaustive, but it does include all the steps that we heard time and time again throughout our interviews, both from leaders who are already excelling at applying for and implementing grants and those trying to shore up their internal processes. We also heard excellent tips from technical assistance providers and other third parties who often help municipalities do this work and implement their grants. The steps are organized across the 4 grant stages, and they should be implemented in relative chronological order. Some steps and sections will need to be replicated repeatedly, either every time a grant is applied for or project is worked on, while others may be completed on a yearly basis or every 5 years, depending on a locality's needs and strategy. And then, yes, the QR code we'll share again at the end. And next slide, please. We want to highlight a place that we think did this process really well, and we kind of modeled some of our steps and takeaways from. So the city of Kingston is a place that started small with their grant applications and implementations to reach its current success levels. Steve Noble started his career with the Office of Parks and Recreation, and with that department, he realized that in order to get his projects moving forward, securing some external funding would really help that effort. So he began applying for grants on his own accord. His early success applying for individual grants started to spread to other departments. And by the time he was elected as mayor in 2016, the city's grant portfolio had grown to $10 million. Now, as the mayor, he has implemented the same philosophy and approach with his staff across the whole city government. He encourages each staff or each team to start small and begin applying for 1 grant at a time to build up their capacity and expertise in that process. This allows staff to really build a sense of ownership over this process and their projects and the key skills for securing and implementing grants. Additionally, as is probably obvious, as funders see a locality have success, it increases their future likelihood of continuing to win more grants. Now, Kingston manages a $96 million grant portfolio, well exceeding its $55 million annual budget. We know these sound like very grand numbers, and we know certainly that every locality has different levels of resources. But the key takeaway we wanted to share here is that a locality can start small, apply grant by grant, and build up its own internal capacity, if that's a strategy it wants to pursue, to grow to a place that is well recognized for its grant success. I'll now pass it back to Jasmine to round out our recommendations.
Thank you so much, Daria. So our final recommendation is really oriented towards state stakeholders. So I will say, utilize these as your talking points as Hudson Valley leaders when you are talking to state agencies and other state leaders, because as we mentioned in our 4th finding, there is only so much municipalities can do to overcome some of the barriers in bureaucratic processes right now that are in place with some of the current grant processes. I will say that we looked at both state and federal grant making. At the level of the Hudson Valley, it is primarily state grants. So that is why a lot of these recommendations are very much targeted towards state agencies. Two of those solutions that we came across in our research were, first, there should be an expansion of formula funding. It feels like a lot of municipalities express that everything feels competitive. And when you're competing to implement just updating your wastewater and things like that, at a certain point, it just feels very frustrating. And so two ways to, shift towards that formula funding. One is looking at a program like CHIPS that DOT does. There was a lot of positive feedback on that. And second, you can look at a program like during ARPA, when municipalities and counties directly received funding, how that enabled them to fund their projects. Second is increasing access to shared services. So that could be through encouraging state agencies to have more shared MSAs, more shared opportunities across agencies to share contract vehicles and things like of that sort that can make it so there is a shared approach to be able to access grant funding. This next table, I won't go through all of it right now, but it is in the report, and I encourage you to read this and to utilize it in your conversations as things that have been expressed across municipalities. So for example, the CFA website, I'm sure folks that are on this call have had their own challenges with it, but one easy thing that seems like a fix is there should be more likelihood, like more access to different logins. When it comes to conflicting deadlines, we heard from multiple municipalities that there would be a grant due the same day or the same week from different state agencies, working to encourage state agencies to have that collaborative conversation to make sure that they are staggering out deadlines, and then things when it comes to standardization requirements. So again, really encourage folks to take a look at this table, think about it, and then think about how they can also present these forward to some of those relevant lawmakers and relevant agencies. And one example of a state agency that is doing this really well and is a program that we heard a lot of positive feedback on was NYSERDA. We have Kelly from NYSERDA on, I believe, right now. So thank you for joining us and thank you for your time. So I'm sure that some of you have interacted with this program, but one thing that we think that this program does really well is that it incorporates having a local coordinator. So there is a CBO partner that works with municipalities to be able to compete for this grant funding. So the way that Clean Energy Communities works is you complete a series of high impact actions related to sustainability. It could be, installing EV chargers. Once you complete that, you are eligible for pre-approved projects. And that pre-approved projects was something that was highlighted as so useful. So it removed the element of that, question on what is a project that we could do, and it has those set for them. So being able to have that clearly defined made a huge difference. So again, encouraging you all as local leaders to, when thinking about models, go encourage other agencies to look at what NYSERDA is doing, because it was really highlighted as a positive example of this. And I'm gonna turn it over to Will, who's gonna wrap us up with our conclusion.
Thank you, Jasmine. We've talked about a lot today. There's a lot more in the report, and we hope that you will go look at it. But a few conclusions that we want to leave you with as we move into our sort of next phase of this conversation. The first is that municipalities in the Hudson Valley can and do win grants. And despite how hard this is, it is possible and it is worth doing for communities. But to do this successfully, communities must invest in their own capacity, and other agencies, whether that be counties or the state, should invest in building up capacity and facilitating coordination. The second is, as we emphasize over and over, a really good way for a municipality to start this kind of work is to focus small and build capacity over time in an iterative process. The third is counties should expand their role as a centralized resource center and a source of real investment in collaborative and regional approaches to grant winning. And fourth, the state plays a big role in the obstacles that communities face. And the state can and should do a better job streamlining processes and then funding some of these shared services with the county or the regional or the municipal level. On our next slide, we have yet again a QR code to our toolkit. This also includes the report itself. And I dropped into the chat earlier a link to the report and to the toolkit for you to check out. we are now going to turn this over very briefly to Beth Gillis from the Lake Champlain Lake George Regional Planning Board, who frankly blew us all away when we first spoke to her. We're very grateful for her time. She's right now at a conference, but was kind enough to give us a little bit of her time. So I will turn it over to her.
So much, Will. So my name is Beth Gillis. I am the Executive Director of the Lake Champlain Lake George Regional Planning Board. We are a 5-county economic and community development agency. So we cover Warren, Washington, Clinton, Essex, and Hamilton counties in the North Country. We are a government entity, which gives us a really unique ability to be able to partner with other governments to be able to create a regional model that we use to secure grant funding and do planning and implementation for our communities. So I started at the planning board in 2008. I was working in the water quality program. I was spending a lot of time with the soil and water conservation districts doing planning around water quality improvement projects. And that was about the time that New York State was standing up its CFA portal and process. And I saw all this money out there and nobody was going for it. And I didn't know why. So in poking around some of the communities, it really came down to writing grants is hard and administering grants is even harder. So I decided that as the regional planning board, I felt like it was something we could do. So I started small in 2010. The first grant I ever got was a $21,000 grant for a septic pump out program on Lake George. The Soil and Water Conservation District for Warren County did the work. And I did the paperwork and I communicated and worked with the agency that was funding it. And it worked out really, really well. So we kind of ramped it up a few years later and we secured a 5-county erosion and sediment control grant. So as mentioned before, these counties would have been competing against each other. They had each individually put in an erosion and sediment control grant to the DEC's WQIP program. So we pooled everybody together. I wrote the grant. Everyone in the counties did the work. They gave all of their paperwork to me and I submitted everything to the state, and the state loved it because they were managing 1 contract versus 5 contracts. We were doing a lot of work and really moving the needle on improving water quality within the Adirondacks, which is a big thing for us. And that's really how we just kind of springboarded this whole grant writing model that we have. So when I took over as executive director in 2018, I hired a professional planner and grant writer. She and I just started writing all the grants we could. When we started out, we spent a lot of time reaching out to communities to say like, hey, this opportunity is available. We know this is going on in your community. Are you interested in a grant? And because we're funded through the counties and we have some capacity funding from the state and federal governments, it doesn't cost them anything for us to write the grants, but we do ask for the administrative money on the back end if the grant is won. And so it's really no risk to apply for the grant for the communities. And we really morphed from that. Now they're all calling us. So it used to be we ran out and called them and they're all calling us now. So there's just me in 2018 at the planning board, and now there's 7 of us. And with every success, we've brought in more money for capacity, but we've also just really done a lot of good in our counties and in our communities. So I've got people now that are experts in kind of their things. I've got community planners, I've got water quality planners, I have a project manager that does all of our infrastructure work. We've moved into big infrastructure projects as well. So since 2021, we have secured $21.6 million in grant funds for our communities. And I think the benefit of the regional model is that we are all in the same office. So we all know what's going on across our 5 counties. And so that whole collaboration that was talked about earlier, we can really facilitate and fuel that because we know how things are happening. And we're also in the same agency. We can take a project from planning with my planners, all the way through implementation with my project managers and the building of the infrastructure and that kind of thing. And it just stays very consistent within our office and everyone knows what's going on. So that's been a great benefit too. So we're currently managing 50 contracts. for projects across our 5 counties, some fully regional, some for communities spanning all, a multitude of state and federal agencies. And so we're really proud of the work that we do. And it's as a community development agency, we're really happy with the success that we've had for our communities.
Thanks, Beth. Before we open it up for questions, I just want to take a minute to reflect on why this is an important topic. Here in the Northeast, obviously, we have infrastructure that's older than other parts of the country. We have parks that sometimes haven't been invested in as time has gone by. And we also have some things in our region that were built with 100% grant funding from either the federal government or the state government decades and decades ago, that but for that funding might have never been built in our communities. And so there is a need for a likewise investment for the upkeep in the state of good repair of those things that were built many decades ago. And so right now we're in this cycle of replacement and refurbishment that needs a similar funding attention to what it got when it was first built. And that's why this capacity to compete, this attention to grants really needs to be paid, because we do have demonstrable community needs, infrastructure needs, housing needs, park needs, economic development desires in this region that we simply cannot fund on our own. So bringing some of that money back to the region to be put to good use on behalf of our folks is a really important concept as we think about why does this grant stuff matter in the first place. So thanks, Beth, for sharing. That's really great. Jasmine, anything before we open up for questions?
Thank you so much, Beth, and thanks, Adam. I just want to give a big thank you. Throughout this process, we spoke with many municipal, county, state elected officials, grant experts, community leaders, and who were incredibly generous with their time. So a huge thank you. Many of you are on this call right now, so thank you so much. It was incredible to work with you all. I'm a native of Hudson Valley, so it was particularly fun to be able to talk to you about your communities. And then finally, a huge thank you to Pattern for Progress, who was a true partner with us on this. Adam and Robin are rock stars, and it was an incredible process. So with that, thanks everyone for being here, and I'm going to turn it over and we can open it up to some Q&A. And while you're going through the Q&A, feel free to take a look at the report and toolkit.
Great. We have a few minutes here. I will ask you to try to raise your digital hand if you have a question, and I'll ask you to be KC, kind and concise with your question, okay? So raise your digital hand if you have a question. We'll be happy to get to you and try to answer it the best we can. We have one in the chat real quick. If the state wanted to, couldn't they expand the mission of the Regional Economic Development Councils to take on this regional planning role statewide in a standardized and coordinated way? So Ian, I mean, that's a potential thing that could be done. Similar concept to what NYSERDA did, which is back in the day when some of those programs got started, they essentially hired a private consultant that was responsible for a few counties here and a few counties there to do what was called a facilitated application process, where that consultant would go embed themselves with the communities and essentially hold the hand of the communities to show them what they were eligible for, how to apply, help them get that funding. And that model could come out of different corners of the state government. And in fact, Pattern at one point suggested something similar to the Environmental Facilities Corporation, which is administering a lot of the water and wastewater money, that if they could just get in the trenches with local governments who are trying to figure out how to apply, they could probably increase the number of applications they're receiving and get this money out in a quicker and more well-organized way to the communities that need those dollars to protect public health and environmental health, right? Drinking water protects public health, good wastewater processing protects environmental health. So it is a concept that could work and is maybe one that we can share with others around the region. Any questions? Again, digital hand. I'll also look for real flesh human hands if you want to stick those up in the video. Any questions at all from anyone in the audience? Going once. By the way, someone has to go first. Don't be bashful. We want to hear more than crickets. Okay, we have a one in the chat again. This one is from Simon Gruber. One obstacle to some of these collaborative approaches is the inevitable competition between municipal applicants for the same pots of funding. how this is really a question for you, Beth. For at the Lake Champlain, Lake George Regional Planning Board or other examples, how do you deal with this concept of municipalities maybe within your service area? They're really going after the same pots of money and they're ending up in competition with each other. How do you square that in that regional collaboration model?
Yeah, that happens a lot. We, in the last couple of years, have written a lot of Department of State comp plan grant applications, and some of them get funded and some of them don't. We are very upfront at the beginning. This is a competitive grant application. We do everything we can. We don't just put in applications to put in applications. We put in applications that are ready. We put in applications that the communities are ready to implement should they get awarded. And sometimes that drops some of the more wishy-washy projects off of the table at the time. And so, the grants we are putting in are very intentional and the communities are ready for them, but we do say it is competitive. But we also tell them, if we don't get it, we'll either look somewhere else or we'll go again. So it's not that we put in a grant, it doesn't get it, and then we're just done and we kind of walk away. We try to figure out how we could do it a different way or through a different funding agency or tweak something so maybe it fits a different program. So we just continue to work on that with them, which they seem to appreciate all of that. Just kind of technical assistance through the whole process. But yeah, to your question, it's competitive and we may or may not get it.
Yep, thanks. Our good friend Tim Wiedemann asked, the closest equivalent we have here in the Hudson Valley to Beth's group is the Hudson Valley Regional Council. They're currently developing their CEDS, their Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, so perhaps this could be raised as an opportunity. Well, in fact, the Hudson Valley Regional Council, which is the region's gateway to federal EDA funding, Beth's organization is that for the North Country and the Adirondacks. So that is a one-to-one comparison. Any other questions? What are the advantages of the competitive grant systems and what would be the disadvantages of going back to a formulaic model? Well, that's a complicated one, Kristen. So the formulaic model, you have to figure out what the formula is based on, right? Is it based on population? Is it based on a per gallon, in the case of wastewater and water infrastructure? Is it based on, a consumption basis? Is it based on road lane miles? And I'll say right off the jump, not every thing you would want to fund through grants has a clear denominator, if you want to think of it from a mathematical standpoint. So I think certain things we want to fund don't have an obvious formula unless you're just going to base everything off population. And although our communities have the same needs at scale, sometimes the costs are a little bit out of scale, where you actually have things costing a similar amount for a large community as it would for a small community. And I'll just say, you're seeing a little bit of the return of what we used to refer to member items, back in the day, where legislators had some authority to apply monies to specific projects in their districts that they knew were very important and might not otherwise get funding. It was really those two things, formula money and some member item money, that plug the gaps between these competitive grants that were made out there. So you're seeing a little bit of a return of that, and maybe that's helping to plug some gaps. It's never enough to plug them all, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind, Kristen. Anyone else on the team have any other thoughts on that?
I'll just add one thing on the benefits of formula funding is, and we saw this, and I mentioned this quickly on ARPA, it was local governments who you wouldn't see normally getting funding, because oftentimes due to the capacity concerns, one thing that we found out is oftentimes municipalities will just not compete. They'll feel too overwhelmed at the competition, particularly when they're a small municipality. They feel like they're competing with, particularly in the Hudson Valley, Westchester got a lot of shout outs as, a big competitor. And so they just say, I'm not going to do it. Whereas if you have a formula model, it allows them to feel, and also to build that muscle of receiving grant funding. And so I think that a lot of folks thought back to that time. And of course, there are challenges with that. And that was overwhelming to some extent. And there could have been probably more technical assistance and other support. But I think there's a real equity component, particularly for small municipalities, in encouraging more formula funding from grant making agencies.
And I'll add one. There's a saying that we hear a lot when this frustration comes up about access to the competitive grants. A lot of small and medium communities have said, that money's really not for us. And nothing could be farther from the truth. No, that money has been allocated and appropriated and set aside by the lawmakers for you. It's just the methodology to get to it was not really well set up for you. So, there's a distinction there that needs to be made. Tim, you want to unmute? I see you got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, comment regarding this concept of formula funding, because I think what's really fascinating is, this question comes up a lot. I'm very active with the college host communities committee through NICOM. And I think what's really interesting about formula ideas like this is, like, if you use population or if you use a variety of other things, I think what's very unbalanced is how different communities are already receiving funding. So, like, in the presentation, you're talking about, the city of Kingston. Like, the city of Kingston, on a per capita basis, the amount of access that they have to sales tax revenue and grant awards is, like, so entirely different than any other municipality in Ulster County. So formula, it's got to be pretty thoughtful, and a simple formula would not work or wouldn't be equitable.
Absolutely, that's true. A couple other quick questions in the chat here. Simon asked if SUNY colleges play a regional role along the lines of what's being discussed. I think I can answer this briefly and with some confidence. No, they really do not play a role in trying to help their host communities get ready for applying for grants. And in fact, they themselves are often seeking out grants to do different things, including related to the state of good repair of their own infrastructure. Heidi asks, and Beth, this might be one for you. For communities that have successfully combined their efforts for applications, what are the logistics for dividing the project management responsibilities, the reporting, and the drawdowns of funding? Do they prepare MOUs? Now, you're acting as a single you're acting as the narrow end of the funnel, right? You're doing a lot of that for them, but if you're applying on behalf of multiple municipalities, are there MOUs that solemnize how all that's going to be done?
Yes, so we always have MOUs, and it depends on the project, but some of the erosion and sediment control projects we've done that are multi-county, it really works out that the town does the project, or Soil and Water does the project, pays for the materials, with the understanding that they get paid back once the grant money comes through. So it's not putting a financial burden on one entity to carry the whole project cost when you're doing a regional approach to those. But yeah, it's all solidified in MOUs that we, send to the state as part of the paperwork. And then, yeah, so we at the regional planning board, we do all of the paperwork. So, invoices get sent to us. We've got stacks of papers for culvert, multitude of culvert replacements that all get added up together, and one file gets submitted to the state for the reimbursement. And we do all of the quarterly reporting. And so, 5 days after the quarter, we send out an email. Hey, what'd you do? Everybody gets back to us, and we throw that all into a report and send it in on behalf of the grantee, depending on the grant, who's eligible and who's holding the contract.
Thanks, Beth. We got one more question coming your way. I'm going to do one first. One issue we encounter is that because we're in really good financial shape, we often lose out on opportunities. Yes, this is a problem. There's a tension here, right? And I'll give you again the tension from the water programs. Most of the drinking water grant programs that the state is administering prioritize serving communities that have either emerging contaminants in their water or a consent order. And so a lot of utilities see that as disincentivizing compliance. If you've been good and you've kept your system in a state of good repair to serve the public health, then you are less eligible for funding that will allow you to continue doing that. And so there's been a big discussion about, should we be disincentivizing good operators? And in this case, should we, limit to some degree communities that have access to grant funds based on some calculation related to their median community income or something like that? And I think there's a good reasonable discussion to be had there about whether some of these barriers to entry or standards are really the best or appropriate. Beth, the question for you is, your organization seems to have an unenviable, not unbelievable, unenviable role of being accountable for grant project performance. How do you ensure that the projects you apply for are successful? Do you screen them first, ensure the municipality has the ability to actually do the implementation? And do you work with communities to increase their capacity to actually go out and complete those projects?
Yeah, we do a ton of project management. So the benefit of being involved in the pre-planning is that you can find out pretty quickly if the project is going to be implemented. Well, things go sideways because things always happen. We always step in to just straighten anything out, or we're always communicative with the agencies and the funding agencies to say like, well, this happened, so here's our options, what do you guys want us to do? So we really do facilitate that for the communities, so that the projects, but we see the projects through all the way to the end. If we've written the grant, we're doing the closeout paperwork.
Great. Before we lose more people, I'm just going to say, what is our plan with all this? Well, from the pattern standpoint, we are going to try to bring this across the region to counties, to local governments, share it with them, and try to promote this idea of, hey, let's try something different. Let's try this at the county level in some ways that we've thought about. Let's try this at different levels and ways we've thought about. If many local governments told us they wish they could collaborate, there's a saying we used to have when I played street ball and we were about to get in a fight. You're going to talk about it or be about it. Like, we can stop talking about it and try to be about it, right? So we're going to try to take this report across the region, take the good ideas that have been cultivated by NYU, the NYU team, and try to convince some communities to just let's take a shot at it and see if we can have a proof of concept here in the Hudson Valley that will inspire others to go try it as well. So that's what our intention is with the report, sharing it with all of you, sharing it with your neighbors. I want to give you back 6 minutes of your day. I want to say thank you for joining us. If you have more questions, email me, email Robin. The folks on the NYU team are pretty easy to find in the digital world. You can get in touch with them as well. And we'll see you around the region. Thanks for joining us. You want to stay on the line, team. We'll chat afterwards. See you, everybody. Thank you, Beth, by the way. I hope this was a good break from your conference.
Thanks. It was nice meeting all of you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everybody.